We're continuing our study on From the Inside Out. And when I thought about Derek, and I talked to Derek about what we were going to be talking about in this class here, one of the things that really kind of stuck out in my mind, and I guess I was really thinking about, is diseases of the heart. And when we talk about fear, and we talk about worry, and we talk about pessimism, which that's what tonight's class was supposed to be on, and what he was going to be teaching tonight. And but since he's not able to be here, we're going to try to tackle fear. And so all of us have some kind of fears of some kind, but we'll think about it and how it affects our life sometimes. Sometimes some of the fears that we have affect some people worse than it does the others. And so as we talk about fear and worry, and also in pessimism, we think about the way that it affects our lives. And I think when we think about the diseases of the heart, I think one of the things we think about is sometimes we need to give our hearts a self-examination. I guess a couple of years ago, I went to my doctor and had a little problem with my heart, had kind of irregular heartbeat or whatever, and he sent me over to St. Dominic's. They had a $99 deal where you go in and you get an MRI, an EKG, you have your cholesterol checked, and several other things checked, and kind of counseled with the nurse. And after that, they didn't find anything wrong with me, and I was in good shape. But it was a screening that St. Dominic offered, and for $99, and I thought that was a deal. And a matter of fact, I wouldn't think that you could get an MRI for less than $1,500, $2,000, just and then have somebody read it. But anyway, as a story went, that was on a Tuesday when I went in there. On Friday night, between my shoulder blades in the back and everything, it started hurting and everything. It manifested itself around to this shoulder over here, and when it did that and everything, I thought I was having a heart attack. Now this is just 4 or 5 days later. So I went and found out I had pleurisy, which if you've ever had pleurisy, buddy, it is tough. The lining of your lungs is called the pleura, and when it gets infected and it gets irritated, buddy, it hurts. You can't take a deep breath, and it really affects you in a way. Back when I began this study on conquering fear and looking at fear, one of the books in my library is a book by Basil Baxter. Some of you that name may sound familiar. Back several years ago, there was a TV program where he was did the message out, and they called it the Herald of Truth. But he had a book, When Life Tumbles In, and that's kind of where I got most of the information I got in some of his thoughts and some of his scriptures and some of the things that he says. But one of the topics that he discusses in his book is conquering fear. And so I'll be using some of his thoughts on that message. Well, if we wanted to look for really a definition of what fear is, Derek came up with I think an excellent definition. He said, what is fear? An unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain or threat. I think that's a pretty good definition. Someone has said, I don't really believe that there's any good thing that can be obtained through fear. Well, I don't really totally agree with that. Sometimes fear serves a very good purpose, and because you just remember, we teach our children when they're small and everything to not go close to the street because the street is dangerous because of the traffic and everything. We tell our children the fear of the hot stove because we don't want to see them burn or hurt or injured in any way. So when children fear their parents, they're well behaved. I remember back when I was thinking about this lesson, I was thinking about my behavior over the years. One of the things that I was thinking about was my dad had a thick leather belt. It was called a razor strop. It was about this wide, made of leather, and it had two sides. One was a rough side and one was a smooth side. And he was kind of, you have shade tree mechanics. Well, he was a shade tree barber. And he cut hair on his front porch, and And when he got through cutting someone's hair like mine, matter of fact, I didn't go to a barber. I never went to a barber shop until I was like 17, 18 years old. But when he lathered around his ears and everything, he used he'd get that razor strop out, sharpen it up, and it had one side, he kind of put a little edge on it, and then he turned it over the other side and it smoothed it out, and so it wouldn't cut your ear with the jagged edge. But one of the things that I remember about that razor strop was it was very interesting, because my dad was a disciplinarian, and what he did is he took that razor strop and he put it in a place in our house where it was very visible. And everybody knew where that razor strop was and what it meant. It was the disciplinarian. I only had that thing used on me one time, and fittingly, it was when my brother and I, who was 3 years older than I, we were talking and writing notes in church. And he turned around and looked at us, didn't say anything. He could have grabbed us up by our shirt tails and taken us out at that time and done a number on us. Didn't do it then. We rode home all the way home and got home, and on Sunday we always went to our bedroom when we got home, and this happened to be in the summertime, and we always took our Sunday go-to-meeting clothes off and put them up nicely. And when he opened the door, my brother and I, who was 3 years older than me, all that we had on was our underpants and our t-shirt. And when he opened the door, we knew what was going to happen. And so I guess my daddy didn't beat us, but it didn't take a lick or two, is all it took with that razor strap. But I always think about discipline applied, lesson learned. When students fear teachers and have the absolute support of their parents, they're well behaved, or should be. When we drive our vehicles down the road, we fear the law enforcement folks because we don't want a $200 or $300 or $400 speeding ticket, or one running a red light, or maybe not stopping at a stop sign. When people fear poverty, they work hard and prepare for one day when they can retire and enjoy life without working. When people fear health issues, they protect their bodies. They get on their meds, and they try to diet if they're having a problem with their weight, or they do exercise. When nations fear their enemies, they prepare for war. And when people fear the judgment, they live moral, upright lives, supposedly. Are there no values in fear? Well, yeah, there is, because there are some dangers in this world which need to be avoided. Fear helps us to avoid things that are harmful and destructive. There's another side to fear. It can have devastating and destructive effects. Basil King's book, The Conquest of Fear, he writes, and listen to this. He said, "During most of my conscious life, I have been prey," that's P-R-E-Y, not P-R-A-Y, P-R-E-A-Y, to fear. I cannot remember the time when a dread of one kind or another was not in the air. So it's kind of almost like around every corner he was looking for some kind of fear, something that he'd be afraid of. Well, truth is, fear is a dominant emotion in our world today. Believe it or not, the dominant emotion of our world is not anger. It's not hate. It's not jealousy or love or sympathy. Those emotions are obviously a part of our everyday life, but fear is really a part of our dominant emotion that really changes the way how we react to the situation that we find ourselves in. Everything depends upon how fearful we may be by what is happening and what's going on around us. Sometimes we just cannot get a handle on some of the things that we fear. Fear burdens some people in a way that it seems as though the person that is afraid of something has changed around their bodies, and it seems to always be reminding them of some kind of fear of some kind. A study has been shown by psychologists by means of laboratory tests that at birth, 2 fears are already present in that newborn baby's life. One, a loud noise, and the other, the fear of falling. Now, I knew that the fear of loud noise was there because when you clap your hands in front of a baby or something like that, he flinches. But the falling, I didn't realize that. So when we begin our lives with just two fears, it's not long before it seems like we just accumulate bunches of fears that interrupt our daily activities. The fear of thunder and lightning and the fear of dark. I tell you, dark is kind of something that's really something for us to deal with from time to time. I know if you come over to my house after the sun goes down, you'll walk through our house and there won't be lamps on in the room and everything. We will have night lights scattered all through our house, so we don't have to turn on the light switch or whatever. We can pretty well move about our house all the way through our house. But I guess the best example of that I can give you of really darkness and how it affects people is when I worked in a warehouse over in Pearl, Mississippi. We were a food distribution company, and we had a big warehouse. It was as big as Sea Wing back here, and it was cooled down. It was cold. It was cold to minus 40 below zero. But occasionally, we would have a power outage in Pearl, and so when that power went off, the door that you went in was the only way to come back out. And when you went in and the power went off and everything, all of our guys that were back there pulling groceries, they were instructed to stay exactly where you are. Don't move, don't go anywhere, because you couldn't see your hand in front of you. And so they had to wait until somebody came with a flashlight to lead them out, because these steel racks they would bump into in the heavy machinery that they were using to pull groceries and everything. A supervisor had to literally not take them by the hand, but direct them out to the outside. Those people that were claustrophobic, they were the first people to holler, and they would be the first people that would let you know where they were so they could get out of there, because if you're a claustrophobic person and everything, you know what I'm talking about. It was like this darkness that totally envelops you, and I don't know whether you ever had that kind of darkness and all. But it seemed like it just almost takes a hold of you. The other thing that I was thinking about, and Derek had on his list, was snakes. And we're going to get into some lessons. I'm going to have some scripture just a few minutes. I want to set the stage for what I'm going to say in just a few minutes. But when I was growing up in small town U.S., Marigold, Mississippi, I grew up fearing snakes, and I guess more than anything else, I learned to respect them. But the fear that I was always taught by my two brothers and my dad, they warned me of some of the serious harm that they could cause, that they could do. And so the respect that I was made fully aware of was one day I actually witnessed a king snake kill another snake. To this day, I will leave the king snakes alone, because I can identify them and I know which ones they are. The rest, the ones that's in my yard over in Rankin County and everything, when I see them, I leave them alone. I go in another direction. But one night, when I was still working, I was getting ready to go to work. And when I went out to get in my car, I walked around the back of the other vehicle to get in my car, because the delivery man that delivered some of the stuff that we ordered over the internet always left a package right there by the garage door. And one time when I didn't look behind my car and everything, I almost ran over a piece of my parcel. And so I learned to go around there. But when I walked around the back of the car and everything, there was something in there, and it didn't look like a stick. It was a copperhead. And so I backed off, went and got my car, and tried to back over it 2 or 3 times, and it took about 3 or 4 times before I finally ran over it and killed it. And I got Mary on the phone. I called her on the cell phone, and I told her what I was doing and everything. So she let me know that she wasn't going out there until that snake was removed from there. So Mary has a fear of snake also too. Fear of people. We may feel at times intimidated by their size or their characteristics. The fear of life itself, the fear of death, taught to us by adults, and as children we watch that behavior, and sometimes we pass our own fears on to our children. One of the things that I guess I remember back when I was in the Air Force, I was in the fire department, and we for 3.5 years, and one of the things that that stayed with me for a while, even after I got out of the Air Force, was there was a certain telephone call when I got, and that certain telephone ring sounded so much like the one that I had the fire station where I was alone. I'd put on my bunkers and do that. So it was that fear, it was that adrenaline rush that came to me just right all of a sudden. See, some people live in a constant fear and feel that some abnormal danger is about to disrupt their daily routine. And fear is just around the next corner. It's what they fear. Dr. George Truett was asked to speak at one of the major universities, and he telephoned the president of the university and asked him to distribute a questionnaire among the students to get their suggestions for subject and the themes for his message. And the most often topic that came up as a result of the themes of his message was, tell us how we can conquer fear. Now, I don't know where the university was, and I don't know what year it was, and I don't know what was going on in that town where the university was, so I don't know what was going on. But these students felt that they needed some way to conquer some of the fears that they had. All of us know all too well some sort of fear and have known it more often than we would like to admit. I'll admit, I don't like elevators. When that door closes and I'm on that elevator, it don't get open quick enough. I just don't like to be in the elevator going somewhere up or down. I like it when that door opens back up and I can put my foot. I used to, when I was working at Eagle Ridge, if I had to go to another floor, I took the stairway. That's back when my knees were a whole lot better than they are right now. But you know, we fear sicknesses. We fear strokes and cancer and heart attacks, and we fear the loss of our eyesight as we get older, the loss of our hearing, loss of memory, and other bodily functions. We fear insecurity. We get anxious about our jobs and what will happen if our business is brought and we just don't have a job and we'll have to be out looking for a job. Those things always are part of our fears. Something might happen. We fear failure in school and in our offices and where we work. In our human relationships, sadly, there's always a possibility of failure. We fear death, which to those who are struggling to keep Satan out of their lives weighs heavy on them from time to time. The writer of Hebrews 2, verses 14 and 15. Now we get to some scripture. Hebrews 2, verses 14 and 15. The writer says, inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil. Verse 15, and release those who fear death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. We don't have to fear death. Satan is very good at distracting us from doing the things what are right. And fear would be one of his tools that he uses to disrupt our lives and to change the way that we think about things. A nationally known psychologist recently wrote in one of his journals, he wrote, fear is often at the bottom of nervous breakdowns. One reason for the alarming increase in nervous breakdowns and other types of mental illness is the feeling of emotional insecurity. During World War II, approximately 2 million men and women were rejected from the boards and later discharged because of mental and nervous ailments. It's been noted that many of our hospital beds are occupied by patients who are really mentally ill. And one of the chief reasons for the illness is the destructive emotion of fear. We're all disturbed from time to time when we read people that die of suicide. In the CDC and their report on leading causes of death in 2018, this is going to be interesting. Suicide was the 10th leading cause of death overall in the United States, claiming the lives of over 48,000 people. This is in 2018. Suicide was the second leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 10 and 34, and the fourth leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 35 and 54. There were more than 2.5 times as many suicides in the United States as there were homicides. A person who had attempted suicide unsuccessfully was asked by his physician, "Why did you wish to end your life?" And he answered, "I was afraid to go on living." Norman Cousins, who is an author and journalist, wrote in his book, Modern Man is Obsolete. He says, when a man can find no answer, he will find fear. In this present world, we often find ourselves right in the middle of confused and sometimes chaotic world and a fear that's almost inevitable. And some people will feel the burden of fear so much to the extent that the only way of escape is to end life altogether. One of the great geniuses of the 20th century wrote in his autobiography, I am a frightened child in the presence of death. Wished he had known what the Bible was all about and how he had read it. Dr. George W. Crane describes how modern day pressures produces ulcers and hypertension and other psychosomatic effects. A person finds it difficult to get a good night's sleep, and so during the day he may try things that become addictive, and sometimes to help him get rest. As a mature adult, he now realizes he's trying to solve his problems all alone. As a result, he often grows fearful about his job, his health, and his human relationships. Quite often he becomes a hypochondriac who goes from one doctor to another more for sympathy than for medication. In a sense, the physicians become more like parents to millions of people or patients who crave love and reassurance. Don't you wish that we could be there to help folks like that out? Dr. Crane goes on to say, however, if such a man links up with God in an active partnership, he can remove his tension at night and, in effect, say a prayer and ask God to help him through those struggles he faces. The fact that this person has a Heavenly Father to fall back on will produce remarkable medical benefits. It will lessen his tension so that that peptic ulcer that he's dealing with will soon be somewhat relieved. His blood pressure will drop because fear elevates blood pressure while peace and confidence reduces it. Now that we know that fear is a problem in our lives, let's look at some scripture and see if we can get some help. Faith in God has always been the only cure for fear. Remember the words that God spoke to Joshua when Moses died. After Moses' death, the Israelites needed a leader to lead them to the promised land. And they had left Egypt and wandered in the wilderness, and they were ready to settle in the land of Canaan. And first they had to clear the land of the inhabitants and the idols that they worshiped. Turn over with me. Let's go over to Joshua chapter 1. Verses 1, we'll do verses 1, 6, and 9. Verse 1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, verse 6, be strong and be of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Verse 9, have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. David gives us an encouragement when he wrote in chapter 23. He says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Psalms 46, verses 1 and 2, follow along with me. God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore will we not fear, even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6. Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6. I could have had these memorized and we wouldn't have to wait to turn in these pages. I'm getting too old to do that. Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6. Reads, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Verse 6, so we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? Revelation 1, verses 17 and 18. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying to me, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am he who lives and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. Amen. And I have the keys of Hades and of death. In 1 Peter 5, verses 6 and 7. 1 Peter 5, verses 6 and 7. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Paul wrote some comforting words over in Romans, the 8th chapter, beginning at verse 28. Romans 8, verse 28. Follow along with me. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Verse 31. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Verse 35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Verse 37. Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Philippians 4, verse 6. Philippians 4, verse 6. If anybody has any comment or would like to share with us some of their fears, just let me know and I'll let you do that. Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Verse 7. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Verse 11. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. And then in verse 13, I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. Isaac Watts is a songwriter and a poet. And he writes in one of the hymns, we have some of Isaac Watts' hymns in our songbook. And I don't know any right offhand, but he wrote a poem, and part of the poem it expresses fear in this way. He says, then I can read my title clear to mansions in the skies. I bid farewell to every fear and wipe my weeping eyes. Paul, in addressing the Romans, said, being therefore justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Where do we find our peace? When we have fear. In our songbook, we have a poem put to music by Charles Wesley. It's entitled, Jesus, Lover of My Soul. And the second verse indicates that if we are to overcome fear, we must have a source of strength beyond ourselves. The second verse goes like this. Other refuge have I none, hangs my helpless soul on thee. Leave, oh leave me not alone, still support and comfort me. All my trust on thee is stayed, all my help from thee I bring. Cover my defenseless head with the shadow of thy wing. The Prime Minister of Japan, speaking from a platform where the flag of Japan would soon stand with the flags of the Allied countries, said this. It is not a treaty of vengeance, but an instrument of reconciliation. The Japanese delegation gladly accepts this fair and generous treaty. The chairman of that conference, Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State under Truman at that time, concluded with this statement. He said, I close this conference with words which in many languages, in many forms, have brought comfort. May the peace of God, which passes all understanding, be amongst us and remain with us always. We become calm and confident as we trust in the promises of God and follow in the steps of Jesus Christ when he walked upon this earth. We have a pattern to follow. We develop an assurance, and we know in a certainty that about how to live and how to solve our problems if we would go to the book and use the book. The closer we follow the Lord, the less we fear. It should be our goal and our task to practice that. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 9 and verse 10, the fear of Jehovah is the beginning of wisdom. And oh, that is so true. Fear of God leads to obedience to his commands. This is not a miserable, gloomy fear. It's like a reverence and an awe that we can have and sustain a relationship with him. Just the fact that we can, the very person that made us and who we are, the makeup of our body and our physical body and our content, that we can have a relationship with that person. And that'd be God. John writes in 1 John 4 and verse 18, he says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love. As we learn to love and trust in God, fear can disappear. I think by now we can see that fear has a place in our lives. The truth is that many people carry a heavy burden on their shoulders because they let fear throw them out of balance. Our balance comes from having a living faith in God and taking advantage of his power to release the burden of fear from us so that we can find true peace. The pattern that Christ left for us in his short time on earth can lift these heavy burdens and give us the confidence to rebound when we're down and out, when our fear has disrupted our peace. In his poem, The Eternal Goodness, John Greenleaf Whittier expresses the Christian's escape from fear when he wrote, I know not where his islands lift, their fronded palms in air. I only know I cannot drift beyond his love and care. Isaac Watts, in one of his hymns, expresses fear in this way. He said, then I can read my title clear. To mansions in the skies, I bid farewell to every fear and wipe away my... So that's one of the things that we can find in our way to overcome our fear by thinking about some of the things that we can be encouraged by. God has always encouraged his followers to fear some things and not to fear others. Luke 12 and verse 5, Jesus says, but I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has power to cast into hell. Yes, I say to you, fear him. And on another note, Paul writes in Ephesians 3, verse 16, he says that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man. Verse 17 is also that follows that verse. Peter puts it this way in 1 Peter 3, verses 13 and 14. And who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed, and do not be afraid of their threats nor troubled. In Ephesians 3, verse 17, says that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. You want to be filled with the fullness of God? Think about the love that he has for us and try to live as he left us a pattern. We need to remember that there was a time when Jesus' disciples were afraid of him. Remember what he said in John 6 and verse 20? It is I. Do not be afraid. Paul in his writings is saying, don't be so quick to give up conquering your fears when it all seems futile. Our Father is patiently waiting for us to call on him to give us the balance that we need in our lives. George Washington, the first president of the United States, in his inaugural address includes some of these thoughts. He said, we would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that almighty being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect. It really is tragic that fear, one of man's greatest persistent defects, is not dealt with by the masses in accordance with God's plan for the betterment of salvation of mankind. Helen Keller once said, "I believe in the immortality of the soul because I have within me immortal longings." Paul said it this way. In 2 Timothy 1 and verse 12, in the latter part of that verse, he said, "For I know whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that he's able to keep that which he has committed to me until that day." I had an interesting book that I'd like to share with you here. Willard Tate wrote a book called Learning to Love. It's got some interesting chapters in there, but one of the things that I think kind of fits into what we've been talking about is the chapter that he wrote, and it's entitled Robbed by Little Things. And I think sometimes fear, the little things in our life that kind of disrupts our lives, just like the fear of me being afraid of riding in an elevator, that kind of fear. People, I know some people have claustrophobic when they close the door on the airplane and get ready to fly, and that door shuts, they get claustrophobia. But he writes this book here, and you may have heard this story before, but I thought it was appropriate. A proud tiger was walking through the jungle one day, roaring at every animal he met. "Who's the toughest animal in the jungle?" he growled. And they all answered, "You are, Mr. Tiger." He went through this scene with one animal after another. And finally he walked up to an elephant and said with his usual bravado, "Who's the toughest animal in this jungle?" Whereupon the elephant wrapped his trunk around the tiger, picked him up, slapped him up against a tree 3 or 4 times, and finally let him fall down to the ground. The tiger looked up with his head spinning and said, "Look, just because you don't know the answer doesn't mean you have to get mad." Unfortunately, life doesn't grab most of us like that and whack us in the head to wake us up. Instead, life has a way of rocking us to sleep. And we just kind of get lackadaisical and let things go by sometimes. It's so easy to slip in the ruts and let life go by without giving attention to the things that are really important in our life. A rut, by the way, this is what he says, not Ron. A rut, by the way, is just a grave with the ends knocked out. "Catch the little fox that ruins the vineyard," Solomon wrote. It's the little things, the subtleties of life that do us in. It's so tough to weigh the value of any one day in our lives. It's hard to see the importance of what we do or don't do today to build a relationship, to share some love, to get a job done. After all, there's always tomorrow. Besides that, we just don't see the connection between what we do today and what our lives will be in 10 or 20 years from now. So we get in the habit of saying, what I do today isn't very important. But every day matters, and every little thing we do or don't do matters. Many opportunities we'll have today to say a kind word or offer a helping hand or write an encouraging letter will never come our way again. Certainly this day will be gone forever once it's done. One of the keys to life, I'm convinced, is to spend major time on major things, not on minor things. To waste our precious minutes on things of little consequence is a tragedy, he writes. In his college class, he asked his students, he says, "What are the major things in life?" One of them said, "Well, relationships are major." "That's good," I said. "What else?" "Getting a college degree, keeping up good grades, getting started in a career." "Well, that's all major. What else?" Someone said, "Starting a family." I'm still listening." Finally, one girl said, "Well, your spiritual life is major." And I thought that was a good answer. And I appreciated the honesty. They were really saying that our spiritual life is an afterthought. They weren't seeing it as a major at all. Sadly, a lot of our company assistants in our Christian community in our churches across America are dealing with minors when they need to be looking at majors to deal with. That's all I have. And I heard the first bell ring, and I'm just assuming that class is going to be over in just a minute. Does anyone want to share anything with us? If not, yes, James?
No, all fear is not bad.
No.
We have to tendency to look at the first century Christians. They were scattered. Because they were scattered, the gospel was spread all over the world.
That's right.
That was a powerful fear. But then you look at Peter.
Yeah.
He had fear and he denied Christ, which is a bad fear. I mean, from that standpoint, what he did, he denied Christ. And you can go back to Daniel chapter 3, and you look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You can see that they didn't have fear of what King Nebuchadnezzar was going to do to them by throwing them in the furnace. I mean, they go on to say, no matter what you do, we're not going to worship that idol. They didn't have that fear. So, I mean, so you got different stages of fear. Some things can be good, some things can be bad. So it depends on how we handle that fear.
What led Peter to start sinking? He got to thinking about it. It was fear. He was afraid that he was going to sink. Hey, Christ said, hey, look, there you are. You got it. You're walking on water. You got to have faith. And when you have that faith that you can stay up there on that water, when he lost his faith, that single second and everything, the water started rising around his ankles up to his knees, and he had to do something. Hey, Lord, help me out a little bit here. You know, so fear among some people, it affects other people more strongly than others. If you deal with your fears and do it a good way, God bless you. Some people have real problems with fear. And I thought this is next week, Derek will be in here. Gary may, you never know. He will deal with worry and pessimism. I wouldn't even want to touch pessimism, so I'm glad he's going to be doing it and not me. Thank you for your attention.